Captain Merrick adjusted his posture in the command chair, his translucent plumage shimmering faintly as he reviewed the day's uneventful reports. His ship patrolled the edges of Concord space, a region rarely visited but rich in quiet beauty. A quiet beauty that was, Merrick thought with a faint hum of approval, rarely disturbed. Then the silence was broken. Captain said Doran, the first officer, his iridescent feathers shifting to a troubled shade of amber, "We've intercepted a distress beacon. It's human." Merrick clicked his beak softly, tension rippling down his wings. Of all species to cross paths with, humans were the most unpredictable. Relatively new to the interstellar community, they were infamous for their strange physiology, alarming adaptability, and chaotic nature. Details, Merrick asked, his voice steady. "The beacon originates from a ship identified as the Silver Horizon," Doran replied, talons flicking across the console. "A human exploratory craft. The vessel is heavily damaged, venting atmosphere. Internal scans suggest structural collapse, and one possible life sign." Merrick let out a sharp exhale. Concord protocols demanded they intervene, but a small part of him wished they didn't. His last encounter with humans had been enlightening in all the wrong ways. "Send a retrieval team," he ordered. "Prepare the medics and the engineers." The Lumilith's drones engaged with precision, maneuvering into the wreckage of the human craft. The Silver Horizon was a ruin of scorched metal and shattered bulkheads, twisted beyond recognition. Merrick observed the operation from the ship's bridge, his unease deepening as updates trickled in. Captain Doran called. "The medics report they've found the survivor." Merrick's feathers flared slightly. "Status?" "Alive." "Barely," Doran said, hesitation lacing his voice. The medics transported the survivor directly to the medbay. The human was tall by Quarivian standards, with broad shoulders and a lean build, though his form was marred by terrible injuries. Dark hair clung to his sweat-slick forehead, streaked with blood and soot. His uniform was torn and scorched, revealing deep lacerations across his chest and a grotesquely mangled arm. Burns covered a third of his body, and yet his chest rose and fell with shallow, determined breaths. This is impossible," Medic Arlex muttered as he ran a scanner over the human. Dr. Zelen, the Lumilith's chief medical officer, approached briskly. "What do you mean, impossible?" Arlex gestured to the human's blood-slicked body. "Look at him. Punctured lung, shattered pelvis, severe internal hemorrhaging. These injuries are beyond survivable." Zelen's gaze shifted to his scanner. The readings confirmed Arlex's words by all known metrics. This man should have been dead. Yet, despite the catastrophic trauma, the human clung to life. "Get him to the medbay," Zelen ordered. "Stabilize him however you can." The medbay was a blur of activity. Quarivian medics moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the human with diagnostic arrays that hummed and pulsed in shades of blue and green. Zelen stood over the slab, his mind racing as he interpreted the holographic readouts. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself. Captain Merrick entered the medbay, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Report, Doctor." Zelen gestured to the human, who lay unconscious, his breathing erratic but stable. "His injuries are catastrophic. By all accounts, he should not be alive. And yet he activated a holographic display, highlighting data points with quick movements. His cells are showing a regenerative response I've never seen before. It's uncoordinated and inefficient, but effective. He's repairing himself." "Repairing himself," Marek repeated, his feathers flaring briefly in surprise. "Yes, though I wouldn't call it deliberate," Zelen replied. "It's more like his body refuses to accept death." "Typical human," Marek said with a dry click of his beak. Zelen's feathers shifted, a subtle gesture of agreement. "He's already stabilized his worst injuries, crudely. Look here," he applied makeshift tourniquets and temporary wound seals. Primitive, but effective enough to buy himself time. Marek's gaze lingered on the human. "What do we know about him?" Zelen tapped his datapad, pulling up the human's identification records. Jackson Flint. 32 standard years. Occupation exploratory engineer. Records show he survived 3 prior life-threatening incidents. A reactor breach, a shuttle crash, and a predator attack on Cavalli Prime. Merrick tilted his head in disbelief. Humans. They have no concept of self-preservation. Hours passed. The human's condition improved, though his vitals remained unstable. Zelen hovered near the central slab, obsessively analyzing every flicker of the monitors. Then, against all expectation, Jackson Flint opened his eyes. His movements were slow, deliberate, but impossibly steady given his injuries. He blinked at the bright lights of the medbay, then focused on the tall, feathered figure standing nearby. His voice was hoarse, but it carried a note of dry humor. "You're not from around here, are you?" Zelen's feathers bristled. "Stay down. You should not be conscious, let alone moving." Jackson coughed weakly, wincing as he shifted. "Yeah, I get that a lot." Zelen's gaze hardened. "Do you comprehend the severity of your condition? You are alive through sheer improbability." I've been through worse," Jackson said with a faint grin. "Lost my leg to a plasma cutter once. Got a shiny new one, though." Zelen's eyes darted to Jackson's right leg, noting the scarred prosthetic attached below the knee. The human's resilience was not an isolated phenomenon, it was a pattern. "You are." Absurd, Zelen muttered, though his voice carried a trace of reluctant admiration. Jackson smirked. "Thanks, Doc. Means a lot coming from you." As Zelen observed the human settling back onto the slab, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his thoughts, a mixture of awe and exasperation. This man, against all odds, had survived what should have been impossible. And Zelen had the unsettling feeling that this was only the beginning. As Jackson Flint lay on the medical slab, recovering at a rate no one could fully comprehend, the Corrivians worked tirelessly to stabilize what should have been a hopeless case. His vitals, though erratic, refused to fail, as if sheer defiance were keeping him alive. Dr. Zelen spent the following hours poring over the human's medical data, trying to understand the bizarre regenerative processes at play. Meanwhile, Captain Merrick remained close by, observing the human with a mix of skepticism and reluctant fascination. "What is your assessment?" Dr. Merrick asked, breaking the silence. Zelen gestured toward the holographic display, which pulsed with streams of chaotic biological data. "Captain, this man's biology is unsettling. His injuries are catastrophic, yet his cells are actively repairing them, albeit inefficiently." "And the pathogen?" Marek asked. Zelen stiffened. "We found traces of it in his bloodstream, an organism unlike anything in our databases. Highly adaptive, potentially dangerous. Yet his immune system has rendered it inert. This alone warrants further investigation." Marek frowned. "So we rescued not just a human, but a walking biological anomaly." "That would be a generous understatement," Zelen replied. Before Marek could respond, a groan came from the slab. Jackson Flint stirred, his head tilting toward the two Corrivians. His face was pale, his movements sluggish, but his eyes carried a sharpness that belied his injuries. "You two sound like you're talking about me," he rasped, his voice rough but tinged with amusement. "Good news or bad news?" Zelen folded his arms. "The fact that you're conscious defies logic." Jackson chuckled weakly, wincing as he shifted. "I get that a lot. So, Doc, how bad is it?" "You have sustained injuries that would kill most species several times over," Zelen said bluntly. "Your survival is improbable." Jackson's lips quirked into a faint grin. "Improbable? I'll take that as a win." Marek stepped forward, his golden plumage glinting under the medbay lights. "You're aboard the Corrivian frigate Lumelith. We recovered you from your wrecked vessel. The Silver Horizon, was it?" Jackson's grin faded. "Yeah, what's left of it, anyway. What happened to my crew?" Marek's expression softened, his feathers shifting to a muted shade of silver. "You were the only one aboard." Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, his features tightening. Then he let out a slow breath and nodded. "Figured as much. It got bad fast." Zelen's curiosity overcame his usual restraint. "Your ship's damage suggests catastrophic failure, plasma scoring, breached bulkheads, structural collapse. And yet you survived. Explain." Jackson opened one eye and smirked. "Good timing and bad luck. Take your pick." Be serious, Zelen snapped, his feathers flaring. I am, Jackson replied, his tone growing heavier. We hit an asteroid field, or something worse. Didn't have much time to figure it out. Hull breaches everywhere. People were getting sucked into the void. And then there was the pathogen. Started hitting people fast. I had to seal myself off in the galley to buy time. Merrick's beak clicked thoughtfully. And your injuries? Jackson flexed his mangled fingers with a wince. A support beam came down on me while I was trying to stabilize a breach. Caught fire after that. Tried to patch myself up, but he gestured to his battered body. Didn't do the best job, I guess. You shouldn't even be able to speak right now, Zelen said, staring at him as though he were a living paradox. Jackson's smirk returned. Yeah, well, we humans are tougher than we look. The next day, the medbay remained on high alert. Though Jackson was recovering, his condition remained unstable, and the Silver Horizon's pathogen was a looming concern. Captain Zelen said, summoning Merrick to the medbay. We have a situation. Merrick entered briskly, his feathers shifting to a deep shade of orange, a color that signaled tension. What now? Zelen gestured to the holographic display. We've isolated the pathogen from the human's blood. It's adaptive, unlike anything we've encountered before. It's possible that his survival is the only thing preventing a wider outbreak. Merrick's feathers rippled in alarm. You believe this could spread to the crew? Unlikely, Zelen said, though his tone carried little confidence. His immune system neutralized it, but if the pathogen mutates, it could adapt to a new host. I recommend immediate containment protocols. Merrick glanced at Jackson, who had been listening from the slab. The human gave a weak wave. I guess that's me. The walking biohazard. This is no laughing matter, Zelen snapped. I'm not laughing, Jackson replied. But look, Doc, if my blood's the key to stopping this thing, use it. I'm not about to let your feathery friends keel over on my account. Merrick's gaze lingered on Jackson, his expression unreadable. You're surprisingly cooperative for someone in your position. Jackson shrugged. Captain, I've been through worse. Let's just fix this so I can figure out what's next. As the hours stretched into days, Zelen worked tirelessly to analyze the pathogen and synthesize a countermeasure using Jackson's blood. Merrick maintained a constant presence, coordinating the ship's quarantine protocols while keeping an eye on their unlikely patient. Jackson, meanwhile, continued to recover at an astonishing rate. His burns were fading, his mangled arm was regaining strength, and his lacerations were closing with a speed that defied explanation. This doesn't make sense, Zelen muttered, his feathers flaring as he studied the latest scans. No species should recover like this. It's unnatural. Call it human ingenuity, Jackson said with a faint grin. It's chaos, Zelen retorted. Merrick chuckled softly from the corner. Perhaps it's both. Chaos and ingenuity seem to go hand in hand with their kind. Zelen sighed, shaking his head. Whatever it is, we can only hope it continues. If this pathogen adapts further, we may all need that human resilience. Jackson flexed his fingers, his grin fading into a thoughtful expression. You guys pulled me out of a wreck. Least I can do is return the favor. Merrick's feathers shifted to a shade of green calm, but resolute. Let's hope your optimism is justified. Zelen studied Jackson's face, his thoughts a swirl of bewilderment and grudging admiration. If anyone could defy the odds, it seemed, it was this human. The Lumilith's medbay buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as Zelen pushed the latest results to his datapad. While Jackson Flint continued to recover, the isolated pathogen was proving more enigmatic than anyone had anticipated. Zelen's feathers flared in frustration. Captain, this pathogen isn't dormant, it's learning. Merrick straightened, his sharp gaze locking on Zelen. Explain. The samples we isolated are mutating, Zelen said. Each new generation adapts faster. If this reaches a host population without the human's immunity, it could spread uncontrollably. Jackson neutralized it, but there's no guarantee we can replicate his response. So what's the plan? Jackson's voice came from the medical slab, raspy but strong enough to carry through the room. He sat up, earning an irritated glare from Zelen. Lie back down, Zelen snapped. I've had enough of lying down, Jackson said. If you're telling me there's a chance this thing could get loose, we need to stop it now. Marek glanced between the two of them. Doctor, what do you need? Zelen hesitated. Time and cooperation. His immune response is unpredictable. To synthesize a stable treatment, we'll need to map every facet of his biology. Sounds like I'm the guinea pig, Jackson said with a grin. You are, Zelen replied bluntly. This isn't a negotiation. Jackson chuckled weakly. Didn't think it was. Let's get to it, Doc. The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. Zelen and his team worked tirelessly, running tests on Jackson's blood, tissue samples, and cellular responses. Jackson, for his part, endured the barrage of needles, scans, and biochemical analysis with surprising patience. As the medics rotated shifts, Marek entered the med-bay to find Jackson alone with Zelen, the doctor furiously typing notes into his datapad. How are things progressing? Marek asked. Zelen didn't look up. Slowly. His immune system is so adaptive it's difficult to isolate a consistent mechanism. It fights like a drunk boxer, Jackson offered, earning a glare. Like chaos personified, Zelen corrected, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Yet somehow it works. Marek leaned closer, observing Jackson. And you? How are you holding up? Still breathing, Jackson replied, his grin unwavering. You know, for a guy who was mostly dead 2 days ago, I think I'm doing all right. You continue to defy expectations, Marek said. Yeah, we humans are good at that, Jackson replied. Keeps things interesting. The breakthrough came as the ship's clock marked the transition into a new cycle. Zelen burst into Marek's office, his feathers flared with a mix of excitement and exhaustion. Captain, we've done it, Zelen announced. Marek looked up from his terminal, his feathers shifting to a cautious green. Explain. We've synthesized a treatment based on Jackson's immune response, Zelen said, holding up a vial of shimmering blue liquid. It's not perfect, but it neutralized the pathogen in simulated tests. Marek nodded. And the risk of mutation? Significantly reduced, Zelen replied. But we won't know for sure until we test it in the field. Marek's gaze turned toward the medbay, where Jackson was seated on the slab, chatting with a medic who looked thoroughly exasperated, and the human. He's stable, Zelen said, healing faster than expected. If he continues at this rate, he'll be fit for duty within a standard cycle. Marek tilted his head. Fit for duty? He's not part of this crew. You might want to reconsider that, Zelen muttered. Marek clicked his beak thoughtfully, then gestured for Zelen to follow. Jackson looked up as Marek and Zelen entered the medbay. He raised an eyebrow at the vial in Zelen's hand. So, that's the cure. Not quite, Zelen replied. It's a treatment. But yes, it should stop the pathogen if it spreads. Jackson nodded. Good. So what's next? Next, Marek said, we take you to Concord space for debriefing. The High Council will want answers, and you may be the only one who can give them. Jackson let out a low whistle. Debriefing with the bigwigs, huh? Sounds fun. Marek's feathers rippled with amusement. I doubt you'll enjoy it, but your survival and your role in stopping this pathogen will make you a subject of interest for the Concord. Jackson leaned back, crossing his arms. As long as they don't try to lock me in a lab, I'm good with it. Zelen's feathers bristled. Don't give them ideas. As the Lumilith resumed its journey toward Concord space, Jackson Flint's presence continued to unsettle the crew. He was an enigma, resilient, irreverent, and endlessly curious. Despite his injuries, he wandered the ship, striking up conversations with the medics, engineers, and even the stoic bridge crew. You ever think about how weird all this is? He asked Doran one evening, gesturing toward the nebula outside the observation window. Doran tilted his head, his amber feathers shimmering in the starlight. How do you mean? All of it, Jackson said. You're a bird person on a spaceship in a nebula. I'm a guy from Earth who should be dead. And now we're working together to stop a killer bug. It's wild. Doran considered this, his feathers shifting thoughtfully. When you put it that way, yes, it is strange. But perhaps that is what makes it worthwhile. Jackson grinned. You're all right, Doran. Merrick observed Jackson from a distance, his mind turning over the human's peculiar nature. Despite everything, Jackson had not only survived but thrived, his presence leaving an indelible mark on the crew. Merrick couldn't shake the feeling that Jackson Flint was more than a survivor. He was a force of nature, a reminder that chaos and resilience could sometimes change the course of fate itself. The Lumilith's arrival in Concord space was met with immediate scrutiny. The sprawling Concord research station, a lattice of gleaming metal and rotating modules, orbited the gas giant Exalaphos, its enormity dwarfing even the Lumilith. As soon as the ship docked, a delegation of Concord officials and scientists boarded to assess the situation. Jackson Flint stood in the medbay, his arms crossed, watching the procession of impeccably dressed aliens with a mix of curiosity and weariness. "This the welcoming committee?" he asked, glancing at Zelen. "Do try to behave," Zelen muttered, his feathers quivering with barely restrained irritation. "These are the highest-ranking researchers in the Concord. They'll want to know everything." Jackson smirked. "Everything, huh? Hope they've got time." Merrick entered the medbay, his plumage shimmering a commanding gold. He gestured to the delegation leader, a crystalline figure whose translucent body refracted the room's light like a living prism. Dr. Kalin of the Concord Science Council, Merrick said. "This is the human, Jackson Flint." Kalin approached, his shimmering face unreadable. "Mr. Flint," he said in a voice that resonated like soft chimes, "your survival and immunity have created significant interest. We require your cooperation to ensure the pathogen you encountered poses no further threat." Jackson gave a casual shrug. "Sure, as long as I don't end up in a jar." Kalin tilted his head, the light within his crystalline form shifting slightly. A peculiar sense of humor, typical of your species. "You're catching on," Jackson said with a grin. For hours, Jackson endured a relentless barrage of questions from the Concord delegation. They interrogated him about the Silver Horizon, the asteroid encounter, and the events leading to his near-fatal injuries. Every answer he gave seemed to spark further questions, particularly when he explained his crude survival tactics. "You sealed a hull breach with ration packets?" one scientist asked, her voice incredulous. "Yeah," Jackson said with a smirk. "Had to use duct tape to hold them in place. Worked like a charm." Zelen sighed from the corner. "Humans," he muttered under his breath. The delegation's interest shifted to the pathogen. Kalin and his team examined the synthesized treatment derived from Jackson's immune response, their discussions a flurry of technical jargon. Meanwhile, Jackson leaned against the medbay wall, watching the scientists with amusement. "Are they always like this?" he asked Zelen. "This is their restrained mode," Zelen replied, his feathers bristling. "Be thankful." As the day wore on, a sudden commotion broke out among the scientists. Kalin's crystalline form pulsed with alarm, his voice sharp. "Containment protocols breached on Deck 4. The pathogen has escaped the laboratory." Merrick's feathers flared as he turned to his comms officer. "Seal Deck 4 immediately. Dispatch security teams." The medbay erupted into chaos as alarms blared through the ship. Jackson pushed off the wall, his expression hardening. "That thing's loose." "It shouldn't be possible," Zelen muttered, his voice tight. "The containment fields." "Doesn't matter now," Jackson interrupted. "What's the plan?" Merrick stepped forward, his golden plumage radiating authority. "We need to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the station. Security will handle containment." "And if they can't?" Jackson asked, his tone grim. Merrick hesitated. "Then we'll need another solution." Deck 4 was a scene of chaos. Concord security personnel in armored suits battled to quarantine the pathogen, which had taken on an eerie, semi-fluid form, spreading in tendrils that sought out new hosts. Several guards collapsed as the organism breached their suits, and their agonized cries echoed through the comms. Back in the medbay, Jackson turned to Zelen. "You said my immune system killed this thing, right?" Zelen hesitated, realizing where this was going. "Yes, but..." Then I'm going down there, Jackson said, already heading for the door. No, you're not, Zelen snapped, his feathers flaring in anger. You're barely recovered. Recovered enough, Jackson shot back. Doc, you said it yourself, my blood's the only thing that can stop this thing. If I can buy your team time to deploy the treatment, I'm going to. Merrick stepped between them. This isn't your fight, Jackson. You've done enough. Jackson stared at him, his expression unyielding. Captain, if I don't go, how many people die? I didn't crawl out of that wreck just to stand around while this thing kills more people. Merrick held his gaze for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Fine. But you'll follow my orders, and you'll have a security escort. Deal, Jackson said. The trip to Deck 4 was tense. Jackson was flanked by two heavily armed guards, their weapons humming with barely contained energy. Merrick led the way, his feathers now a muted gray, a sign of his inner conflict. As they approached the quarantine zone, the air grew thick with a faint, sickly sweet smell. The pathogen had spread rapidly, coating the walls and floor in a shimmering, pulsating substance. This is worse than we thought, Merrick muttered. Jackson stepped forward, his eyes scanning the writhing mass. All right, you ugly bastard, he muttered. Let's see if you like me as much as the last batch did. Before Merrick could stop him, Jackson strode into the infected area, his steps deliberate. The pathogen reacted immediately, tendrils lashing out toward him. For a heart-stopping moment, Merrick thought the human would collapse like the others. Instead, Jackson stood firm, his breathing steady as the tendrils wrapped around his arm. The pathogen pulsed, trying to invade his body, but something extraordinary happened. The shimmering substance began to retract, its tendrils shrinking, as if repelled by his presence. It's working, Zelen's voice came over the comms. His immune system is neutralizing it. Jackson grinned, though sweat beaded on his forehead. Yeah, well, it still stings like hell. How long do I have to stand here? Just a little longer, Zelen replied. We're dispersing the treatment now. Within minutes, the synthesized cure was released into the air system. The pathogen shriveled and dissolved, its tendrils retreating into nothingness. The quarantine was lifted, and the station was safe once more. Jackson stumbled out of the infected zone, his legs shaking but his grin intact. Merrick caught him before he could fall, steadying the human with a firm hand. Reckless as ever, Merrick said, though his tone carried a hint of respect. Yeah, but it worked, Jackson replied, breathing heavily. You're welcome. Back on the Lumolith, Jackson sat in the medbay, his arm bandaged but his spirit unbroken. Zelen hovered nearby, muttering about humans and their absurd recklessness, while Merrick stood silently, watching the human with something close to admiration. You saved them, Merrick said, finally. Jackson shrugged. Figured it was the least I could do. Besides, someone had to. Merrick nodded. Chaos and resilience. That's humanity in a nutshell. Jackson smirked, and proud of it. As the ship prepared to depart the station, Merrick couldn't help but think that Jackson Flint's arrival had changed more than the fate of the Lumolith. He had proven that even in the face of the impossible, humanity could rise to the occasion, leaving the galaxy a little more amazed and a little more unsettled than before.